Blue has always been one of the most desired colors in the gemstone world, but something unusual has been happening beneath the surface. As more blue stones enter the market, many begin to look increasingly similar. Color becomes easier to find, alternatives become easier to substitute, and distinction becomes harder to recognize. Yet a small group of blue gemstones continues to resist that pattern. Not because they are louder, not because they are more heavily promoted, but because their rarity does not rely on popularity alone. Their identity is built into how they form, how they interact with light, and how rarely nature repeats the same conditions twice. While some blue stones become interchangeable, others become increasingly difficult to replace. Understanding why reveals something deeper than rarity alone. It reveals how perception changes when similarity becomes abundant, and why certain stones remain distinct even as the category expands. Starting with a blue gemstone that quietly separated itself from the idea of substitution. Ranked 10th, blue spinel, the blue stone, that quietly escaped substitution. For decades, certain blue gemstones have existed in an unusual position within the gem market. Admired for their color, yet rarely recognized for their individuality. Among them, blue spinel occupied a particularly complex role. Its appearance often resembled more widely known blue stones. Its color could overlap with familiar expectations, and for many years it was frequently grouped into a broader category of alternative blues. Not because the material lacked rarity, not because the crystals lacked quality, but because perception had not yet fully separated identity from similarity. In markets driven by visual recognition, stones that appear interchangeable often behave differently from those that establish distinct identities. When multiple gems offer a comparable color experience, the conversation shifts away from individuality and toward availability. And availability changes everything. Some blue gemstones became widely accessible through improved mining output, expanded geographic sources, and consistent cutting yield. As supply increased, subtle differences between stones became less visible to casual observers. Color alone was no longer enough to signal rarity. Blue spinel followed a different trajectory. Fine specimens form under more constrained geological environments, limiting the consistency of new material entering the market. Unlike stones produced across multiple large-scale deposits, high-quality blue spinel remains irregular in availability. Production does not follow predictable cycles. Supply does not expand in response to short-term interest, and each discovery period tends to reinforce the perception that availability is never guaranteed. As gemological research improved and distinctions between spinel and other blue stones became more widely understood, the narrative surrounding the material began to evolve. No longer positioned as a substitute, blue spinel gradually developed recognition as a distinct collector stone. Its optical character, subtle variations in tone, and limited appearance in commercial jewelry streams contributed to a growing sense of differentiation. When a gemstone transitions from being perceived as replaceable to being perceived as specific, its relationship with broader market shifts often changes as well. Because once identity becomes clear, comparison becomes less direct. And when comparison becomes less direct, commoditization becomes less likely. Blue spinel does not dominate headlines in the same way as more historically publicized blue gems. Yet its quiet separation from interchangeable categories illustrates an important principle. Rarity is not always about visibility. Sometimes rarity begins when a material stops being seen as one of many and starts being recognized as one of few. And that distinction becomes increasingly important when the broader category begins to expand faster than attention can follow. At number 9, a blue gemstone whose identity was obscured for decades by a name that created more confusion than clarity. Ranked 9th, blue zircon, a natural gem that spent decades competing with its own name. Long before modern jewelry markets became saturated with uniform shades of blue, zircon already existed as one of the oldest minerals ever discovered on Earth. Some zircon crystals date back more than 4 billion years, forming during the earliest stages of the planet's geological history. Yet despite this remarkable origin, blue zircon entered the modern gem trade, carrying an unexpected burden. Not geological, but linguistic. Its name became entangled with cubic zirconia, a synthetic material introduced much later as a diamond simulant. The similarity in terminology created a lasting distortion in public perception. For many observers, the distinction between a naturally formed mineral and a laboratory-created simulant became blurred. Over time, hesitation replaced curiosity, and hesitation often reshapes demand more quietly than supply ever could. Fine blue zircon, however, possesses optical properties that separate it clearly from both common substitutes and many widely available bluestones. Its internal structure produces high refractive brilliance and strong fire, allowing light to disperse with a level of intensity that is rarely associated with stones mistakenly perceived as common. Unlike widely commercialized blue gems, whose appearance can often be replicated through treatment or synthetic production, natural zircon's visual performance originates from its crystal chemistry itself. This distinction becomes increasingly significant in environments where visual identity plays a central role in collector interest. Because stones that can be easily replicated tend to converge towards similarity, but stones that derive their appearance from complex internal structure tend to remain visually distinct. Another factor shaping blue zircon's position is the irregular nature of gem-quality material entering the market. Deposits capable of producing fine fastable zircon do not operate under the same continuous, high-volume output associated with more commercially dominant bluestones. Instead, availability tends to fluctuate, influenced by localized geological conditions and deposit-specific constraints. This irregularity contributes to a perception of unpredictability, a characteristic often observed among stones that resist becoming standardized commodities. When availability cannot be easily scaled, direct comparison with mass-produced bluestones becomes less straightforward. As gemological education expanded and distinctions between zircon and similarly named materials became clearer, the narrative surrounding blue zircon began to shift. Collectors increasingly evaluated the stone based on its intrinsic properties rather than its misunderstood association. And when identity becomes more precise, classification becomes more stable. Blue zircon demonstrates how rarity can remain partially obscured when terminology interferes with recognition. Yet once confusion diminishes, differentiation often becomes easier to observe. Not because the material has changed, but because the framework used to evaluate it has become more accurate. Some gemstones separate themselves through origin, others through chemistry, others through visual behavior that refuses to appear identical from every angle. And occasionally, rarity becomes most visible when a stone refuses to remain visually consistent in the first place. Ranked 8th, Iolite, a blue gem that refuses to show only one color. Viewed from one direction, the stone appears deep blue. Tilted slightly, the color softens into violet. Rotated further, traces of gray begin to emerge, subtle but unmistakable. Iolite rarely presents a single visual identity at once. Its pleochroism, the ability to display different colors depending on viewing angle, introduces a complexity that challenges the idea of uniform blue. Many widely available blue gemstones achieve consistency through treatment, calibration, or large-scale cutting standardization. Their color remains predictable across large quantities of material. Predictability in commercial markets often encourages interchangeability. But Iolite behaves differently. Its optical structure causes light to travel through the crystal in ways that produce directional color variation, meaning the stone's appearance changes depending on orientation relative to the observer. Two stones with similar chemical composition may appear noticeably different when cut along different axes. This variability makes replication more difficult, not because the material is impossible to obtain, but because controlling its final appearance requires a degree of precision that limits uniform production outcomes. In gemstone markets where visual sameness often signals abundance, stones that resist visual uniformity can develop a quieter form of differentiation. Iolite rarely floods commercial jewelry displays with identical hues. Instead, fine specimens reveal a layered color behavior that rewards careful observation. The phenomenon becomes particularly evident under changing light conditions, where shifts between blue and violet tones introduce depth not immediately visible in static viewing environments. Such visual instability can act as a subtle barrier against commoditization, because commodities tend to rely on predictable appearance, and predictable appearance allows large-scale substitution. Iolite's optical variability reduces the likelihood of direct one-to-one replacement across stones of similar size and shape. Each cut must account for orientation. Each orientation influences saturation. Each saturation influences perception. When viewed through the lens of collector psychology, materials that produce consistent surprises often maintain attention longer than materials that reveal everything immediately. Complexity extends viewing time. Extended viewing time strengthens memory. And stones that are remembered differently often become categorized differently. Not every blue gemstone reveals its identity instantly. Some require movement, some require patience, and some resist standardization simply by refusing to look the same twice. Ranked as 7th, Kyanite, a blue crystal that resists standardization at the structural level. Pressure deep within metamorphic rock layers produces environments where only a narrow range of minerals are able to stabilize. Under these conditions, kyanite forms elongated blade-like crystals whose internal structure behaves differently along different directions. Unlike most gemstones, hardness in kyanite is not consistent across its crystal lattice. Measured along one axis, the mineral demonstrates relatively high resistance to scratching. Measured along another, the resistance drops significantly. This directional variation introduces a practical complication long before a finished gem ever reaches a display case. Cutting orientation becomes critical. A facet aligned incorrectly can introduce weakness. A minor structural inconsistency can increase the likelihood of fracture during shaping. Material loss during cutting can exceed expectations associated with more structurally uniform blue gemstones. While many commercially dominant blue stones benefit from predictable crystal behavior that supports efficient cutting yields, kyanite rarely offers that advantage. Consistency supports scale, but directional fragility introduces limits to consistency. Gem-quality kyanite therefore tends to emerge from a narrower pipeline, not only because formation conditions are specific, but because usable material must survive a more complex preparation process. In gemstone markets influenced by visual similarity, production efficiency often determines how frequently a material appears in standardized jewelry formats. Stones capable of supporting large-scale calibrated cutting programs can enter global supply chains more easily. But materials that require orientation-specific cutting strategies tend to remain less uniform in their commercial presence. Kyanite occupies this latter position. Even when crystals are discovered in suitable sizes, the proportion of rough capable of producing stable faceted stones remains comparatively limited. This influences availability patterns that differ from widely commercialized blue gems, whose physical structure allows for more predictable manufacturing outcomes. The result is not simply geological rarity, but practical rarity. Availability becomes shaped not only by where the mineral forms, but by how much of that material can realistically survive transformation into a finished gemstone. In categories where many blue stones can be produced in calibrated sizes with minimal structural risk, consistency reinforces interchangeability. Kyanite's structural anisotropy disrupts that process. Each crystal introduces variables that cannot always be standardized across large volumes of production. This reduces uniformity across finished stones. Reduced uniformity weakens the conditions necessary for commoditization. Because commodities tend to rely on repeatability, and repeatability relies on structural predictability. Kyanite demonstrates how rarity can originate not only from scarcity of occurrence, but from resistance to efficient replication at scale. Even when demand exists, nature does not always cooperate with manufacturing logic. Some materials remain uncommon not because they are unknown, but because their internal architecture quietly limits how often they can appear in finished form. And when structural behavior itself constrains consistency, interchangeability becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Ranked 6th, Jeremejevite, a blue gem identified long before it was understood. Discovery does not always guarantee recognition. In the late 19th century, mineral specimens later classified as Jeremejevite were already present in collections, quietly cataloged among other borate minerals, whose external appearance revealed little about their potential as gemstones. At the time, analytical tools capable of distinguishing subtle chemical variations were limited. Many transparent crystals were evaluated primarily through visual similarity rather than detailed compositional study. As a result, early Jeremejevite specimens were occasionally grouped with visually comparable materials, their distinct identity remaining largely unnoticed outside specialized mineralogical circles. The mineral itself forms under highly specific geochemical conditions involving aluminum and boron-rich environments that rarely intersect in concentrations sufficient to produce transparent crystal growth. Even when these conditions align, crystal development often produces fragments too small or too included for use in faceted gemstones. For decades, Jeremejevite remained primarily a mineralogical curiosity rather than a presence within jewelry markets. Specimens appeared in academic references and private collections, but widespread recognition of its potential as a gem-quality material emerged gradually, influenced by improvements in analytical precision and growing interest in lesser-known transparent minerals. As spectroscopic methods and crystallographic testing advanced, clearer distinctions between borate species became possible. Previously overlooked crystals could now be identified with greater confidence. With identification came reclassification, and with reclassification came a clearer understanding of how rarely transparent Jeremejevite occurs in nature. Unlike more commercially dominant bluestones that benefit from multiple producing regions, gem-quality Jeremejevite appears sporadically, often associated with pegmatitic environments where formation conditions vary significantly across deposits. Such variability influences the consistency with which new material enters the market. Irregular appearance patterns contribute to a perception of rarity that is not driven by sudden depletion, but by the realization that qualifying specimens have always been uncommon. In gemstone markets shaped by recognition cycles, the moment when classification becomes precise can alter how a material is perceived relative to broader categories. Stones once grouped under generalized descriptions begin to occupy more defined positions. Jeremejevite illustrates how rarity can exist long before widespread awareness acknowledges it. The mineral did not become scarce suddenly. Its scarcity was always present within the geological record. What changed was the ability to observe it clearly. Because rarity does not always emerge from new discoveries. Sometimes rarity becomes visible when older discoveries are finally understood in greater detail. And when clarity replaces approximation, materials that once appeared interchangeable begin to reveal distinctions that had remained hidden for generations. Ranked fifth, Grandidierite, when rarity becomes clear only after standards become stricter. In mineral collections assembled during the early 20th century, Grandidierite appeared primarily as opaque or translucent fragments, appreciated for scientific interest but rarely associated with faceted gemstone use. Its distinctive bluish-green to blue coloration attracted mineralogists, yet the expectation of transparent material remained limited for decades. Most known specimens displayed internal structures that scattered light unevenly, preventing the optical clarity typically required for traditional gemstone cutting. For much of its documented history, Grandidierite occupied a category closer to reference specimen than jewelry material. The perception began to shift when a small number of transparent crystals entered gemological examination environments. Advances in microscopic imaging and spectroscopic analysis allowed experts to distinguish between translucent, mineral-grade material and the exceptionally rare occurrences of gem-quality transparency. As classification precision increased, it became evident that only a very small fraction of known Grandidierite material possessed the clarity required for faceting. What had once been considered a moderately uncommon mineral became recognized as an exceptionally limited source of transparent blue gemstone material. This shift did not occur because the mineral suddenly became more scarce. Instead, the definition of what qualified as gem-grade Grandidierite became more precise. As clarity thresholds became better understood, the pool of qualifying stones effectively narrowed. In gemstone markets influenced by categorization, definition plays a critical role in shaping perceived rarity. When classification standards are broad, more material appears to meet category expectations. When classification standards become more refined, distinctions emerge between specimen grade and gem grade populations. Grandidierite illustrates how rarity can intensify as understanding evolves. The mineral itself remained geologically uncommon throughout its known history. What changed was the level of scrutiny applied to its evaluation. Transparent specimens revealed optical properties that aligned with collector interest in stones exhibiting both unusual color and limited availability. Because these specimens represent a small subset of already rare occurrences, their presence reinforced the perception that Grandidierite occupies a narrow position within the spectrum of blue gemstones. Such narrowing of category boundaries influences how stones are grouped, compared, and ultimately distinguished from more widely available blue materials. When fewer stones qualify under stricter definitions, direct substitution becomes more difficult. And when substitution becomes more difficult, commoditization pressure often weakens. Grandidierite demonstrates that rarity is not always determined solely by how often a mineral forms. Sometimes rarity becomes more apparent when evaluation criteria evolve to reveal how few examples truly meet the threshold for gem quality classification. As understanding deepens, categories refine. And as categories refine, certain stones begin to stand further apart from the broader field of blue gemstones that once appeared visually similar at first glance. Ranked fourth, Hauyne, a blue mineral that rarely grows large enough to become a gem. Most mineral formations do not immediately suggest the scale required for faceting. Within volcanic environments where temperature, pressure, and chemical composition fluctuate rapidly, crystal growth often occurs under conditions that prioritize speed over structural continuity. Hauyne emerges from such environments, forming within alkaline volcanic rocks, where rapid crystallization can limit the time available for large crystal structures to develop. The result is a mineral known for its vivid blue coloration, yet typically encountered in fragments that remain too small to support conventional gemstone cutting. While many blue gemstones derive their availability from deposits capable of producing crystals large enough to yield calibrated stones, Hauyne's formation pattern often leads to dispersed grains rather than sizable single crystals. Even when high-quality material is present, individual crystals frequently measure only a few millimeters across. This introduces a distinct form of rarity, not the rarity of total absence, but the rarity of usable scale. Gemstones that regularly occur in larger crystal sizes allow cutters to produce a wider range of proportions, shapes, and carat weights suitable for jewelry markets. Stones that rarely reach those dimensions remain inherently limited in their ability to appear consistently within commercial inventories. Hauyne occupies this constrained position. Its color saturation often rivals more familiar blue gems, yet the pathway from geological occurrence to finished gemstone remains restricted by the small size of most crystals. Because crystal growth frequently terminates before reaching dimensions suitable for stable fasting, a significant proportion of recovered material never enters the gemstone pipeline. In markets influenced by visibility and repetition, stones that rarely appear in larger sizes tend to remain less exposed to broad substitution patterns. Large quantities of uniform stones encourage interchangeability. Fragmented availability encourages differentiation. Even when multiple occurrences of Hauyne are documented across different volcanic regions, the consistency of gem quality size remains limited. This creates a distribution pattern where individual stones appear sporadically rather than continuously. Irregular presence reinforces the perception that supply does not easily respond to fluctuations in demand. When gemstone categories rely heavily on calibrated size ranges, materials that rarely conform to those ranges remain insulated from the pressures that influence more abundant blue stones. Hauyne illustrates how rarity can emerge not only from geological scarcity, but from the simple reality that most crystals never reach the dimensions required to enter the broader gemstone market. Because when size itself becomes the limiting factor, production cannot easily scale. And when production cannot easily scale, standardization becomes less likely to occur. In a category where many blue stones are available in predictable sizes across global inventories, materials that rarely achieve comparable dimensions quietly resist becoming part of interchangeable supply chains. Their presence remains intermittent, their appearance less uniform, and their identity less dependent on repetition. Ranked third, Benitoite, a blue gem formed where unlikely elements meet. Barium and titanium rarely share the same geological environment in concentrations sufficient to form transparent crystals. Their chemical pathways tend to diverge long before conditions allow structured crystal growth. Yet under a narrow set of geological circumstances, these elements combine within hydrothermal environments associated with serpentinite alteration zones in what would later become San Benito County, California. The resulting mineral, Benitoite, emerged as a barium-titanium silicate whose crystal structure allowed the formation of distinctly blue transparent specimens. Such chemical alignment does not occur easily. Geological systems capable of supporting the coexistence of barium-rich fluids and titanium-bearing minerals require a precise balance of temperature, pressure, and fluid chemistry. Even slight variation in these conditions can interrupt crystal formation entirely. Unlike mineral families that occur across multiple continents under broadly similar geological settings, benitoite formation appears strongly linked to a limited set of environmental variables rarely reproduced elsewhere. This narrow formation window contributes to its reputation as one of the more geographically constrained blue gemstones known within modern gemology. Transparency within benitoite crystals introduces an additional layer of rarity. While opaque mineral specimens exist, faceable material suitable for gemstone cutting represents only a fraction of documented occurrences. The mineral's trigonal crystal structure also influences how light interacts within the stone, often producing a level of brilliance that contrasts with the more diffuse appearance associated with certain other blue materials. In gemstone markets where multiple blue stones can be sourced from a variety of global deposits, materials linked to narrowly defined geological environments tend to exhibit different availability patterns. When formation conditions cannot easily be replicated across multiple regions, expansion of supply becomes inherently constrained. This limitation does not rely on market demand alone. It is embedded within the geological record itself. Benitoite demonstrates how rarity can originate from chemical improbability long before market recognition occurs. The stone's existence reflects a convergence of elemental availability and environmental stability that is rarely sustained long enough to produce transparent crystals. Because when formation depends on a precise alignment of uncommon variables, frequency becomes limited by natural probability rather than industrial capability. Such probability-driven rarity often produces supply patterns that remain relatively insulated from broader fluctuations affecting more abundant blue gemstones. While other blue materials may become increasingly interchangeable as global production expands, stones tied to narrowly defined geological processes tend to remain less influenced by volume-driven substitution cycles. Benitoite illustrates how rarity can persist not through scarcity of interest, but through scarcity of opportunity for nature to repeat the same conditions again. Ranked second, Paraiba tourmaline, a color intensity that redefined expectations for blue. Electric saturation is rarely associated with transparency in natural gemstones. In most geological environments, trace elements responsible for color tend to produce softer tonal ranges when crystal structures allow light to pass through with minimal obstruction. Yet within copper-bearing tourmaline, the presence of trace copper ions introduces an unusually vivid chromatic response, a blue that appears internally illuminated rather than simply colored. The visual effect differs from conventional blue gemstones, whose appearance relies primarily on iron-related coloration mechanisms. Copper influences how light energy is absorbed and re-emitted within the crystal lattice, producing a level of brightness that often appears unusually vibrant even under low lighting conditions. This optical intensity alters how the stone is perceived relative to other blue materials. Rather than blending into a continuum of blue shades, copper-bearing tourmaline often creates the impression of a distinct color category. Such distinction influences comparison behavior. When a color appears visually separable from the broader group, substitution becomes less intuitive. The geological conditions required for copper-bearing tourmaline formation involve complex interactions between pegmatitic fluids and trace copper concentrations that rarely coincide at sufficient levels to produce strongly saturated crystals. Even when copper is present, distribution within the crystal lattice must remain consistent enough to allow light transmission without excessive internal disruption. This balance between color intensity and transparency introduces a narrow formation pathway. Multiple deposits have produced copper-bearing tourmaline, yet the most strongly saturated blue tone material tends to remain limited in occurrence. Color perception plays a significant role in how gemstones are categorized within collector frameworks. When hue, tone, and saturation align in ways that produce an appearance difficult to replicate through treatment or alternative minerals, visual identity becomes more stable, because comparison relies heavily on perceived similarity, and similarity becomes less convincing when color behavior appears distinctly separate from commonly available bluestones. In markets where many blue gemstones share overlapping tonal ranges, materials that display unusually strong internal luminosity tend to remain visually memorable. Memorability influences recognition. Recognition influences categorization. Categorization influences whether a stone is evaluated alongside common alternatives or apart from them. Paraiba-type copper-bearing tourmaline demonstrates how chromatic intensity can influence the perception of rarity independently from carat size or geographic origin alone. When color itself becomes a defining characteristic that resists duplication, interchangeability weakens. And when interchangeability weakens, the conditions that typically encourage commoditization become less applicable. Some gemstones derive rarity from where they are found. Others derive rarity from how they behave under light. And in rare cases, color itself becomes sufficiently distinctive that it forms a reference point difficult to approximate through other materials. In first place, Kashmir sapphire, a blue that became the reference point for rarity itself. Between the late 19th century and the early 20th century, a remote region within the Himalayas produced a small number of sapphires whose visual character differed subtly yet unmistakably from most other blue corundum deposits. These stones did not rely solely on depth of color. Their appearance revealed a softness within saturation, a velvety diffusion of light that reduced sharp internal reflections while maintaining strong chromatic presence. Microscopic inclusions arranged within the crystal structure interacted with incoming light in a manner that scattered illumination evenly across the interior of the stone. Rather than producing a purely reflective brilliance, this structure generated an optical texture often described as glowing from within. Such visual behavior created a recognizable identity distinct from other blue sapphires formed under different geological conditions. Equally significant was the brevity of the deposit's productive period. Mining activity in the Kashmir region occurred within a relatively narrow historical window, influenced by high-altitude terrain, logistical constraints, and the limited accessibility of the original deposit zone. As production diminished, the material already circulating within collections began to take on increased importance as a reference standard. When a gemstone becomes associated with a specific historical moment rather than an ongoing supply chain, its presence within the market begins to function differently from stones that continue to be extracted in larger quantities across multiple regions. Kashmir sapphires gradually came to represent more than a geographic origin. They became part of a descriptive vocabulary used to evaluate other bluestones. Terms referencing texture, softness of saturation, and internal visual balance often trace conceptual lineage back to these early Himalayan specimens. When one material becomes the basis of comparison for many others, its role extends beyond simple classification. It begins to shape expectations for the category itself. While blue sapphires continue to be mined in various regions worldwide, the specific combination of visual characteristics associated with Kashmir material remains closely tied to a particular geological environment and historical timeframe. This connection between identity and origin contributes to a perception of rarity that is reinforced not only by physical scarcity, but by the difficulty of replicating the precise visual signature linked to the original deposit. Because benchmarks influence how categories evolve. And when a benchmark is formed under conditions that cannot easily be repeated, its position within collector frameworks often remains stable across changing cycles of availability. Kashmir sapphire illustrates how rarity can transcend individual specimens and influence the broader definition of what constitutes exceptional blue gemstones. Some stones are valued for their color, some for their origin, and a small number become embedded within the language used to describe rarity itself. When identity becomes inseparable from historical context, comparison becomes more complex. And when comparison becomes more complex, substitution becomes increasingly unlikely. Not all rarity is immediately visible. Some blue gemstones appear similar at first glance, until attention begins to reveal differences that are not easily replicated. As supply expands across the broader category, similarity becomes more common. And when similarity becomes common, distinction becomes increasingly meaningful. Certain stones remain difficult to replace, not because alternatives do not exist, but because their identity is shaped by conditions that are rarely repeated in the same way twice. Geology does not follow trends, crystal formation does not respond to demand, and rarity does not always move in parallel with popularity. Understanding how some blue gemstones remain distinct reveals something beyond color alone. It reveals how recognition evolves when abundance increases. Because when many options begin to look alike, the few that cannot be easily substituted often become easier to remember. And sometimes what appears similar today becomes unmistakably different over time.